Hello, and welcome to the Boffin Buzz, the podcast for anyone fascinated by farming's future. Well, hello everyone, and welcome again to another episode of the Boffin Buzz, where it's all happening with science and farming and animal nutrition. Today is the topic. So I'm very excited that we have joining us today Brian Kenyon from ABN. Good afternoon, Brian.
Good afternoon, Tom.
Great. Now, Brian, you're an animal nutritionist, senior poultry nutritionist with ABN, as I understand it. But what I'd like to ask first is what the three key things are that you would like to that you think would transform productivity on farm. What do you think they would be?
I think the three key areas is that as an industry, the monogastric bit, the poultry and pig industry, is so reliant on imported proteins. We need to be more self-sufficient. The second one, which has really come to the fore as I've sort of investigated alternative proteins, is, I suppose, a lack of understanding by the different parts within that supply chain. Both from the understanding of the animal nutritionist of the arable world and the limitations and constrictions that are on that.
Yeah.
And actually, as a animal nutritionist, particularly a poultry nutritionist, trying to make sure that we keep the diets and what we are feeding the bird up to speed with this ever-changing genetics, how that bird is continuously improving.
No, absolutely. Oh, those are really good topic areas there, Brian. And I can think of a whole raft of questions as you were talking there of things that I'd like to explore with you anyway. But we ought to start first of all by introducing you. I mean, we come together under the NCS project, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But let me ask you first of all about yourself, Brian. Could you just give us a bit of background as to how your interest in animal nutrition and how you came to be where you are now?
How did I become an animal trainer? Well, really, the background, the starting point is I come from non-farming background. I've always wanted to get into agriculture, but as a young lad, you trying to get in directly into farming, unless you were born directly into a farm, it was very difficult. I did go down the route of trying to be the vet and did a lot of work to try and study to become a vet. But I had the misfortune of contracting meningitis when I was 18, which completely disrupted my A-levels and my study. So unfortunately, my plans to be a vet didn't happen. And I then thought, well, what else? What else can I do? So I then went on to do an animal science degree with an emphasis more on nutrition. And that's where I really got my interest into nutrition.
I see.
Yeah.
And you've been at ABN for quite some time. ABN, also known as AB Agri. I can never quite tell the difference between what is ABN and what is AB Agri.
AB Agri is a group of businesses. ABN is a monogastric feed business in the UK.
Right.
So within that group, there are other businesses that are there's an enzyme business, there's a premix business. There are other businesses within the AB Agri umbrella.
I see. And you've been with ABN for some time, I think. Is that right?
I've been with ABN about 8.5 years.
Right. I see.
Yeah. Prior to that, I was working with a large duck integration, which was my yes.
So you went from ducks to chickens, I suppose.
Yes, to all poultry, from rather being quite specialised in a niche area into a more wider portfolio of animals to deal with.
I see. And what could you tell me about sort of some of the changes that you've seen in the industry in your time working in it?
I've been involved in the industry somewhat, unfortunately, since 1995. So I've seen quite a lot of changes. As I joined the industry, we were on the cusp of BSE. And one of the first things I had to work through was how do you take meat and bone meal out of diets?
Yeah.
That led to a big learning curve on how to use soya. And you can understand how all of that sort of impacted of that. I then remember the conversations or the discussion points around genetically modified materials,
Yeah,
particularly the soya. And
absolutely.
latterly, the real challenges to the industry have been driven by both political and diseases. The
Hmm.
poultry industry, particularly, coming under significant pressure from avian influenza.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I must say, actually, that's that's really interesting. I remember the sort of deep, dark days of meat and bone meal, and of course, that is why we, increased our dependence on soya. And now soya itself is, that has come under the microscope increasingly. Which brings us very neatly to the NCS project. This is the Nitrogen Climate Smart project. So, just for those listeners who haven't heard about this before. This is a large project involving 17 industry partners. It's DEFRA funded, £5.9 million project over 4 years. We're now 15 months into it. Boffin is one of the partners. It's led by PGRO, and then ABN. You're another partner in the project as well, and it's all about reducing emissions in agriculture. Our bold aim is to reduce emissions by 1.5 million tonnes per year, which can be achieved if we increase pulse cropping across the UK to 20%. It's currently about 5%. And if we reduce the amount of soya in livestock rations by 50%. Then we can achieve these bold aims. That's over 50% of the actual reduction in emissions that agriculture can achieve. So, it's a big ambition. I stress that we're not planning to do that all in 4 years. What we're doing is we're working with up to 200 farmers with various projects and on-farm trials in particular, which we'll talk about in a bit, to prove the concept, if you like. And we're also tracking the carbon emissions, as I say, of these 200 farmers is the plan, so that we can prove the concept that this can do it. I mean, in terms of your involvement in the project, Brian, it's obviously very much on the monogastric livestock side. Why is it important that we? I mean, I guess it's the soya, as you mentioned before.
Well,
It's the inclusion of soya within the diet. Why is it important to have a look at that?
well, we need to look at how our reliance on these imported proteins. We rely solely on particularly one protein source, real protein source now in most monogastric diets. That brings other things as well. You're so susceptible to the ship coming across the Atlantic and being delayed. What happens if it's delayed by a week? Well, unfortunately, we need to feed the chicken. The chicken doesn't stop. It needs
Hmm.
its daily food. So that constant reliance on just imported proteins is not. I don't believe it's fully sustainable. But also as a agricultural part of UK agriculture, it should be joined up with the rest. Might not be 100%, but it should have links in. And there is opportunity here for the poultry industry, particularly, to be more engaged with the whole supply chain of British agriculture.
Hmm.
It can be seen that, yes, it is a great cereal user, and 60%, 65% of the diet is UK predominant grown cereals. But there is a big opportunity that other 20, 25% can be UK produced.
Absolutely, and I guess there's the whole food security element. I mean, you just said there, what happens if your shipment of soya is delayed? Well, what happens if it's blocked through some political means? Perhaps
Yeah,
the world is a different place as it was 5 years ago.
yeah. Well, we've all seen on the news the issues of the Suez Canal. It was originally blocked by a
Mm.
ship running aground, and that added 2 weeks to the transfer of materials coming from China. And then latterly, that same area has come under attack through a war conflict in that area. So there
Mm.
are other things out of our control. I also remember the impact of low rainfall in the Amazon basin, impacting the actual transport of soya out of South America, restrictions on shipping through the Panama Canal. If somebody had said that to me 5 years ago, you wouldn't have thought about it, would we?
No, no,
Yeah?
exactly. Yeah, I guess having control over our own destiny, I think. Now, well, one of the interesting aspects about this project is it's not the first time the livestock industry has looked in some detail, or the monogastric industry has looked in some detail at protein source. And there was the Green Pig project, I think, some
Project.
time ago. I mean, now myself, I've got a very much an arable background, Brian, so I don't know the ins and outs of it. Could you sort of give us a little bit of a sort of background as to why the Green Pig project is relevant to what we're doing here?
The Green Pig project was probably the first bit really looking at using homegrown pulses. It was looking at whether field beans could go into pig diets and completely replace soya. And it successfully showed that pigs could be produced on no soya or very low soya, including diets.
Right,
The problem was it was done, and unfortunately, I would say it did increase slightly the feed cost. There was
right,
no appetite to take on that additional cost. And I think at the time, unfortunately, the pig industry was going through quite a harsh time where costs were going through the roof and the value of their end product was decreasing. So there was no way of recovering any of that cost. Um, I suppose the other part as well is it was pre the conversation about carbon, your
yeah,
carbon footprint. So it was all pre before, and I would say they were about 9, 10 years in front of where they should have been. Yeah,
right,
before
yes.
the rest of us. Yeah,
Yeah, but I guess the important thing that it established is that you could replace soya with homegrown proteins.
proceed.
And that's were there any problems that were associated with that?
There was no direct problems associated with just replacing that. It was just that on cost to the feed.
Right. Yeah.
And margins are so small, particularly in both the pig and poultry industry, passing on that cost to the end user was just not possible. So there was no real appetite to take it on without getting some form of premium or, I suppose, buy-in from the consumer to
Hmm.
actually support it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, moving to the NCS project, then, Brian, would you like to just explain some of the things that ABN specifically are looking at?
Well, from a feed point of view, we were really interested in understanding how can we increase the demand for beans. As you said, Tom, only is it 5% of the acreage is down for
Hmm.
beans. What we need to do is create a demand to drag that drag that acreage up. So we wanted to understand what level of beans we could sensibly put into poultry diets.
Right. I see.
The pig one already being answered with the green pig. So when I say poultry diets, we were looking at predominantly broiler production and also layers. The
Right.
majority of the UK poultry industry. We really wanted to concentrate on broilers because broilers are the biggest users of imported.
I see. And now, and I think ABN, you've already done quite a few trials in this area. Is that right?
Yeah, so we've done some benchmarking of what happens if you put feed beans. So we've undertaken a series of broiler trials. We started last September, and we've completed 12, 12 batches through broiler farms and gathered all of that data together. And it
Right.
has shown that beans can be fed to broilers without impacting weight performance, but it unfortunately did impact the feed conversion.
Right. I
And the
see.
feed conversion being the amount of kilos of feed you need to feed to get a kilo of chicken meat. It did make that worse, which would seriously impact the financials for the broiler grower,
I
unless the
see.
feed was a lot cheaper.
So is that I mean, that doesn't sound like good news to me, Brian.
It sets a line, gives us an indicator today to say to the end consumer, if you would like us to do this, this is a potential cost.
Right.
But it also gives us an idea of what we need to do to improve on the field bean. That is
Right.
just taking the field bean or the faba bean as it is. Processes, pre-treatments, selection of variety.
Right.
You know, uh, are there things like that that we can actually do, and we can reduce that difference down to a more acceptable cost? It'd be great
Okay.
if we could reduce or remove all of that cost, but I don't think we'll get there. But what we can do is move it very close to where soya is today, and then the consumer will be more willing to buy into the concept.
Yep, I see.
Yeah.
So, I mean, actually, it's worth pointing out here that one thing that you've already noted is that within these trials, those farmers taking part in the trials, those producers taking part in the trials, found a drop in performance, and that's one of the things about this, isn't it, Brian? Especially with monogastrics and with chickens, that you can't afford as a farmer in this game, as a producer in this game, to fiddle around with your rations because it's going to cost you dear.
Yes.
And that's something that we need to note about the people who are taking part in the trials, that they're doing this experimental work for the benefit of everybody else. They're taking the hit, if you like, in order to explore where we can go, to de-risk it for these other producers. I'm interested to know about the specific farmers that you have involved in this. I mean, they're presumably on board with this, and they're happy to help you with these trials.
They're very interested in their own business to understand how they can improve the carbon footprint of their business.
Yeah,
But they are also open-minded to realize, as I sort of said, it's trying to quantify what the potential costs would be, and then how we, over the 3-4 years of the project, work on strategies to reduce that cost.
yeah,
If I'll be very honest, if it wasn't going to incur costs, we would be doing it today. The problem we have is soya is such a good raw material for pigs and poultry.
mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
it has had 20 years since we had to take meat and bone meal out. It's had that time to really establish itself as the protein in monogastric diets, and it takes a lot to kick it to kick it out.
yeah. Well, let's
And
drill down into that a little bit, because I know that one of the things that you've been looking at are the actual sort of constituent proteins in the diet, and some of the ways in which that can be manipulated through treating the beans and so on. Could you just talk about the specific proteins and amino acids that we're dealing with here?
yeah, when it comes to the amino, I'm assuming the listeners are aware when we're talking amino acids, they are the building blocks of protein. There are 22 amino acids that are required to build protein, but it's not an even ratio. It's
Right.
a variable ratio, and the key ones for building muscle is lysine. Now, plant materials are naturally quite low in lysine, but soya is actually the highest,
Right.
hence why it became the more favourable material. Um, but it's not just that ratio of amino acids that's important. It's also within the plant, they have factors that stop animals digesting them, because ultimately that
Okay.
plant didn't want the animal to digest the bean or the seed. It wanted the animal to consume the nice pod, absorb carry the bean and spread it for it as part of its thing. So within bean, there are anti-nutritional factors, or these factors that stop the natural breakdown. And those are the key things that we have to work on. How do we reduce those factors and get them to a level that maximizes the digestibility of that available amino acids? And there are
Mm.
a number of ways at which we can do that. We can reduce the amount of fibre by dehulling the bean.
Right.
That makes it a more concentrated material, a more concentrated form of nutrients for the for the for the.
Is that a fairly simple process? I mean, is that
It's
something that?
it's a it's a fairly simple process, but unfortunately, it's another process, so it
Yeah,
adds cost.
yeah, I
Yeah.
see.
Um, we can turn to the plant geneticists, which have actually probably done all this work anyway, and they have various varieties which are
Mm.
low in these natural anti-nutritional factors. So there needs to be that communication through the supply chain from customer, i.e. the feed company, to the arable farmer to say, actually, if you grow these varieties of beans, they are more suitable for animal production. So we'll be able to use more of them anyway.
I see.
So it has to be that better communication down the supply chain.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Well, that brings us neatly to the next point that you wanted to discuss in terms of joining up the UK agriculture supply chain. So would you just like to describe a little bit more what you mean by that?
What I'm trying to get to on that is making sure that all the different parts of the chain, because we're all part of the food chain, we're all producing food in the end point, and it's making sure that every part of that chain understands the needs and the constraints of that different section. So as a feed manufacturer, we take in a large quantity of raw materials produced in the UK. But historically, a lot of those raw materials were just classed as animal feed raw materials. So they may not have been the highest quality. They may have been
Mm.
quite variable. And that brings in more challenges to being able to use them properly. So when we start talking about using UK produced pulses, we need to make sure that those pulses are as best quality they can be. Animal feed should not be seen as taking second grade materials
Mm.
or materials highly contaminated with toxins or molds or that sort of. It needs to be a quality product if we're going to put it into feeds at 20% level.
So, what sort of issues are we talking about there? You know, what issues does the industry need to address when it comes to? I mean, as I said earlier on, Brian, my experience very much is on the arable side, and I've grown beans. I'm growing beans on my farm here in Oxfordshire, and so I know some of the challenges that farmers face. But how do they translate into the challenges that you face as a nutritionist working with it?
Well, the way I look at it is I need to have a very consistent product. I'm relying on that material to supply key nutrients into a diet. Now, soya is routinely relatively quite consistent. So we need to make
Mm.
sure that that replacement is as consistent as it can be and doesn't bring anything additional with it, any of these unusual toxins, molds, or anything like that, so that
Right.
we as feed manufacturers have the confidence to say we can put that in at 20% because it will mean that we do get the levels of nutrients in the feed that the animal requires. Our customer gets the performance that we say they're going to get,
Mm.
and overall, there is still value in the chain. Not
Yeah.
one part is going to be hit by an implications on the ultimately the bird's performance.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
So
I'd just like to,
yeah,
defend our listeners at this point, Brian. That in terms of you're talking to some of the best farmers in the
yeah.
UK with the boffin buzz. So when it comes to things like molds and so on, I don't think any of us have got problems with molds or those sorts of issues within our grain store and so on. But there will presumably be quality issues, other quality issues or factors about the crop that we could perhaps look at, improve in order to make life easier for the nutritionist. Is there anything in particular? And I don't know whether perhaps it might not be something that we can do on farm. Maybe it's something about the varieties that we choose.
Yeah, as I sort of mentioned in one of the earlier parts of the conversation, if we could actually join up and look at growing varieties which are naturally low in Vicine and convicine.
Right.
I'm aware that the plant breeders have these in their portfolio, but because, and I think this is a good example of how the supply chain fails. The feed industry are not saying we need this, so you arable farmers are not actually being told grow these. If
Well,
that, but whereas if I was a flour miller, I would be telling you I need these key
yeah.
factors if you're going to supply me with milling wheat, or if I was a malter, you need to create these specific characteristics for a malting barley. All we're
Right.
saying at the moment for a bean, just grow beans and we'll use them.
Yeah.
So if that, yeah.
Yeah, no, well, absolutely. So now I've heard about Vicine and convicine. I think is that yeah, that's
Yep.
right. And I've heard them referred to by various plant breeders. And we're beginning to talk about it. But I have to admit, Brian, I don't know an awful lot about what these two things are. Is there any chance you could just give us an idiot's guide to what they are?
In a nutshell, they are two compounds naturally present within beans that disrupt animal digestion.
Right.
It will particularly disrupt liver function within a a chicken, particular, and particularly a laying hen. So, which, if you get it wrong, the liver is a key organ in the formation of an egg. So, if
Right.
you disrupt that, you're going to disrupt egg production. They are very robust products, compounds, and there is no known easy way of reducing them in the bean. So if they're there, they're present.
I
So
see.
it is one of the limiting factors on how much bean you can put in the diet.
I see. So, what's the problem from an arable side? I mean, why we're not growing, and why is the plant breeder not breeding varieties that are low in Vicine and convicine?
The plant breeders have at least three varieties that I'm aware of, which are spring bean varieties. I can't
Hmm.
remember the names off the top of my head, but there are at least three in the list of available seed. It's just that there probably hasn't been the true conversation, the conversation between the user and the producer saying,
Hmm.
please, can you grow these beans over your usual bean? I don't know sitting here whether those particular strains of beans are similar yielding or have other negative factors. I would actually have to pass that back to you, the arable colleagues, to give me the pluses and minuses of changing over to them.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
in the
as you say
same
that.
way of yeah,
Sorry.
in the same way of sort of saying, well, at the moment, unfortunately, there are only spring varieties available.
Hmm.
How would that impact how an arable farmer would see growing beans? Does it have to be a winter variety that goes in or a spring variety?
Yeah, as you say, I mean, I guess I would defer to people at the PGRO at that point, and they've got the expertise in the varieties. But just looking at the varieties that are low in Vicine and convicine, have you looked at those in feeding trials, and does it actually give that benefit that you're looking for?
This is our plan for September placements. We are
Right.
waiting for this year's harvest to get new material,
Okay.
and working with Frontier, we're hoping to identify growers with these particular varieties, and then we can target the trial so that we can actually quantify. So that helps as our second stage of the trial. We, in essence, have done a trial of saying if we feed beans, this is that. If we target certain varieties, how much do we draw back of that performance drop? And at the same time, we're also looking at other ways of pre-treating those beans.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
yeah, so we're also looking at the implications of cooking the bean
Okay. Well,
pre-treatment.
how can that help?
There is another compound within the bean called trypsin inhibitor. Trypsin inhibitor inhibits the enzyme trypsin. Trypsin is the main enzyme that every animal produces to digest protein.
I see.
So as it says, again, it's another protection of by the bean to stop us digesting it once we've consumed the pod. It's natural way of saying, I'm going to stop you eating me. I want you to eat the nice fleshy bit, but you're not going to digest the seed.
Right.
Now, what we do know is through using soya, which again is also high in trypsin inhibitor, we know that by cooking to a certain temperature, you can denature that inhibitor and therefore remove its impact. That has been learnt with soya. So that's one of the positives coming from the soya experience that we can apply to beans.
Okay.
The
And again, I
challenge
mean,
we
when you say cooking or roasting, what are we talking about here? Again, is this something that farmers may be able to do themselves on farm, or is
I,
it an industrial process?
I believe it will need to be an industrial process so that we have a consistent level of cooking.
Right.
The challenge when you cook proteins is if you overcook them, they combine with the carbohydrate fraction within the material and become an undigestible compound.
Right.
So it's a fine balance of getting the cooking to reduce the trypsin inhibitor, but not overcooking. So you end up with a product that's not digestible.
I see. So, and are you looking at that as well? Looking at the actual process of cooking or processing the beans as well?
We're not the ABN directly are not, but there are other
No.
members within the project team, so MacArthur Agriculture and the SRUC. They're looking at the process of dehulling, roasting, and cooking of the bean, and how that changes the digestibility of the bean contents for the chicken.
No, fantastic. Well, no, that's actually thanks for mentioning that, Brian, because we do have another Boffin Buzz recording with John MacArthur and MacArthur Agri, and he did talk in that Boffin Buzz about some of the work that they're going to be doing. As you say, I think those trials are taking place this autumn or this summer autumn as we speak, actually. So we'll have results on that shortly, and also do please go to our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and look for Boffin, and then do follow us our YouTube channel, where we've got some information about some of the other work that's going on within the NCS project, including the work that MacArthur Agri are doing. But we're nearly out of time. But let's talk about your third topic that you mentioned earlier on, in terms of keeping up with the requirements of ever-changing genetics. I presume you're talking about the genetics of chickens here.
Yes, yeah. The chicken, whether that's a broiler chicken or as a laying hen, is continuously changing. And it's particularly the broiler chicken has significantly changed even in the last 10 years, never mind 20, 30 years. And it is really a very efficient converter of nutrients into lean muscle. And it is becoming very good at that. And the key for us is we've got to maximize that bird's potential for the actual farmer to make any money. If he takes his if it loses a day's worth of growth, that could be the matter of profit or loss for the
Mm,
farmer. And for a lot of them, 35 days is now the end of a crop. So most of the chickens that you will see on a supermarket shelf are not much older than 35 days.
right.
So there is a lot of time pressure on them to perform.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
there is also the other bits that are changing. There are other pressures being put on the broiler industry to look at much slower growing breeds, which have
Yeah.
a very different requirement for nutrients each day. So again, it's responding to the public's demand for different products. I
Well,
suppose
there's also.
I'm trying to think of an analogy for your arable side. You don't really get people asking you for one type of wheat versus another, really, do you?
Well, I mean, there's milling wheat and feed wheat,
Wait.
I suppose, and things. But one aspect that does sort of come into the news quite a bit these days is sustainable production, I suppose, in terms of, and there is concern over just how we're breeding these birds, and do they have strong enough legs to support their bodies, things like this, and there's the welfare issues and the sustainability issues, Brian. Presumably that comes into the equation as well.
It does, but I want the sustainability. The modern broiler is a very strong, robust genetics. The genetics, the primary breeding businesses have done a great job at improving on those birds. That doesn't mean they didn't get it wrong at stages and there was challenges, but they are really have come to the fore. One of the key things that impacts the carbon value of a chicken is its FCR. How much feed has it consumed to produce a kilo of that? If you don't maximize that FCR, you're adding quite a lot to the carbon value. So if
Yeah.
you take the pressure off, sorry, not the pressure. Let me say, if you change the growth pattern of that bird and go for a slower growing bird, its carbon value starts to go through
Yeah.
rapidly increase. And there have been some good studies completed through the British Poultry Council utilising ADAS to actually calculate those numbers, which do show that slower growing birds have a much higher carbon cost and impact on the environment than a traditional modern broiler.
Yeah. I see. Now, one area that is a particularly keen area for me within genetics is gene editing. And I just wondered whether, with these new forms of genetics that are now coming through, in your view, what role can they play within this area of taking genetics forward for broilers and layers?
I think for broilers and layers, conventional genetic selection it's still got a lot of space to go. The value of gene editing, I think, has to be very careful when it comes to animals. Just from my personal experience, I remember Dolly the sheep, which
Yes.
was the first cloned sheep, and how that caused quite a thing. It gets too close to the being a human. I thought, yeah.
Hmm.
Whereas genetic editing of plants is a little bit further afield or further from the human, so it's a little bit more acceptable. But I personally believe there's still enough for conventional genetics. The only area I can see it being of real value to all animal production is if they can identify genes that give animals greater disease resistance to key viruses that are
Yeah.
causing problems, whether that's African swine fever in pigs, which is going around Europe through the wild boar, or avian influenza in poultry. If it's something that gives them that, I would support, but for day-to-day production values, I think conventional genetic selection still has space.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, I mean, my interest in this, Brian, as you may know, is that boffin farmers are involved in bringing the first gene edited crops to the UK, the first three cereals that have been developed. We're in the unique position that they have relaxed the laws on gene edited crops, uniquely in England, I might say. That's not even the devolved governments, let alone the rest of Europe. And so we are in a great position now to have a look at these on farm and explore them in an open and transparent forum and see what they do and talk through some of the issues. As you say, as you rightly point out, the issues with plants and driving productivity forward, as well as answering some of the disease resistance, and then opening up the channels for improving soil health and so on. There's a lot that can be got at with
Which,
plants. There are probably certain areas with gene editing, as you've highlighted, that we probably wouldn't go with animals, but at the same time, there could be some opportunities, especially with disease resistance. But let's not dwell too much on that, because I should think that's probably a topic area that we're going to be returning to many
yes,
times over the next few years.
I would be interested in knowing where your crops are going after you've grown them.
Well, that's yet to be decided in terms. I mean, one of the crops that we're looking at is low acrylamide wheat, and this is wheat that's low in asparagine that causes acrylamide when it's cooked. And we are looking to take that right through to products, food products. And currently, the food manufacturers keep acrylamide levels low through extra processing additives that they can add. But this gives the opportunity of a natural way, and obviously, less processing in our food products, which on the face of it looks like a good thing. But until we've actually got the products in our hands, until we've actually tested it through the mill and so on, we don't know whether that is going to be the case. But that's one of the things that we're looking at. We haven't got we've got something in forage, so a barley that's got high lipid forage in its leaves and stems that we're going to be taking through into trials to see how it affects performance in dairy cows. So that's going to be an interesting area. But yeah, watch this space, Brian.
Yeah.
As I say, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of that we'll be looking at this in some detail over the next few years.
Hopefully through this NCS project, we'll identify the areas which the plant breeders need to target on beans and other pulses to make them even more attractive to both human and animal feed.
Yeah, well, you never know. That could be something that gene editing can look
could
at
help answer
in beans.
Yeah.
But just that's all we've got time for, really. But before we end this podcast, Brian, I wonder if you could just give us a view of, where is all this going? Where do you think we're heading to with some of the changes that we talked about within this? What's your hope? What's your ambition, if you like, for your particular area of animal nutrition?
Yeah. What I would like to see is, as I sort of said, at the moment, I would say a broiler diet is 65% UK produced cereal. So the diet is about, I would like to see that by the end of this, within the next 5 years, upwards more towards 85%, 80 to 85 UK produced raw materials. And the question I've got there is,
quite ambitious.
But why not? Whether that is a direct use of raw materials, plants materials grown in the UK, or it's co-products coming out of the food chain. So it's getting that upwards. There is no reason why we cannot get it into that ballpark number on paper, but we need everybody in the supply chain to be joined up and thinking and aware of opportunities, and the actual consumer just a little bit more willing to pay for a high quality product.
Yeah, I guess, in a way, Brian, you could sum this up as slightly the sort of chicken and egg situation here, if I may coin the pun, in terms of, it's about going back to what you were saying earlier about taking the whole supply industry forward, the whole supply chain forward. And that's one of the things that I think is really great about the NCS project, is that it is looking at that, bringing the arable side along with the livestock side. And so, there's no point in raising the performance of the diet or the nutritional quality of beans within the broiler industry, for example, if then the producers can't find the homegrown beans to supply it. So we have to bring everybody along at the same pace, don't we?
Yes. The worst thing for me would be we do all this work proving the value of beans and the fact we can grow without soya, and we stop importing soya, and then we start importing faba beans from a third party. That would be the wrong way to go. The whole part of this project, and the whole part I really see of it, is improving British agriculture. Let's get rid of one of those big sticks that is often beaten on British agriculture about our carbon or our emissions. Let's get it back let's get together and prove to the general public we can respond, we have responded, and this is where we've got to.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great place to end this, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on the Boffin Buzz. And thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode of the Boffin Buzz. We'll return soon with another episode. But for now, thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.